All right, guys, welcome back to a new study, and we will begin the book of Ruth. Normally, you guys know that I do study in the New Testament. We've done a lot of New Testament books, but this time I think it'll be a blessing for us to do a little Old Testament study. And Ruth is a very short book, and it's also a very narrative book, but it is filled with a lot of imagery as well as it highlights a number of things such as our kinsman-redeemer, and it is very it's Christological in the sense that it points and prepares us for the pathway, that is the lineage that leads to Christ, but directly it points to the lineage of David. But anyway, so we start our new study in the book of Ruth, and as always, we always start with a form of introduction in the book where we look at the author, the date, the occasion, and the purpose of the book to give us a universal understanding for the writing of the book. So, with that, let's just simply begin with the author. Now, according to Jewish tradition as well as Christian tradition, we believe that the prophet Samuel wrote the book. And the overarching idea of the prophet Samuel writing the book of Ruth is to give not only legitimacy, but also, because we see this at the very end of the book, to speak of the descendancy, that is the lineage of King David. And in that lineage that he gives to King David, remember what is so important about King David. King David was the king that God chose to bring forth the Messiah. That is, remember in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God promised to build David a house, a kingdom, and with that kingdom would come a son. That kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom. That is the kingdom of the Messiah. So this promise was given to King David. So therefore, to give some information about the lineage of King David, we have the insertion of this particular book, the book of Ruth. But not only that, as David is given the role as king by God, we also see that this infers directly to the prophecy in Genesis chapter 49. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that, but I'll just simply to say, in the prophetic word that Jacob gave concerning his sons, namely Judah, he spoke that the scepter of power, that is the rule of the kingdom, would remain with Judah. So even Jacob prophesied concerning Judah and the role that one of the descendants of Judah would play in the messianic role. That is, from Judah would come the Messiah. And in the family of Judah. Now, one thing that we know, and let me just simply say it this way, I think it'll make it a little bit even easier, especially as we get to the end of the book of Ruth. One thing that we know is that Judah had sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, Tamar, and out of that was, I think that's in Genesis 38, and out of that relationship, she bore to him a son, Pharez. And it is Pharez that is in the lineage. David is in the lineage of Pharez. So the point is, we tie Judah with the prophetic promises that was spoken by Jacob concerning rulership, that is the Messiah. So you tie Judah in to David, and thus you are linking David with the prophecy of Jacob in chapter 49 and the Messiah and his rule. And so thus what Samuel does for us, he makes this tie, and it's in some sense of a way, it gives legitimacy to the Davidic rule of David as king, prophesied by God through Judah. Through Judah, even explicit promises made to King David, 2 Samuel chapter 7. But anyway, so this is Ruth, written by Samuel. And so now let's talk about the date. Ruth itself tells us that the book was written during the times of the judges. How and the book in the time of the judges is roughly about 1300 BC to roughly 1000 AD. And that is during the time of King David. So that's the idea. So roughly that period, right? Now we're not trying to include the time of the reign of King Saul. And we also understand that Samuel himself was a transitional judge. And what I mean by that is Samuel was the last judge. From Samuel, you get King Saul, and this begins the reigns of the kings. However, King Saul was rejected from God and thus brings in King David, and King David in him is the establishment of the kings, really established in the kings in the sense of the messianic promises. All right. So the date we have, so the period of the judges, that's what we were talking about. 1300 roughly 1000 time of David. However, the time for the writing of Ruth appears to have an early time. So when we see the book of Ruth talking about Boaz and things of that nature, we're going to talk about all of that as we talk about the descendants or the particular people that are named in the book of Ruth. It is an earlier writing. But the point that I'm making here is since it is clear that the writing comes during the time, most likely Samuel wrote this during the reign of King David. Okay. So as we do talk about those genealogies, there are a couple of things that you need to understand. Number one is that the genealogies that are being covered, that is being covered, that is the genealogy of King David. The writer is not trying to list every father of King David. There are gaps. There are gaps that are in the genealogy, and these gaps are only mentioning the notable names because we have roughly a period of over 300 years in the time of the writing of the book of Ruth, from the time that they talk about Obed and the reign of King David and the mentioning of King David himself. So we'll see in the genealogy, even as it was a common practice for the Hebrew writers, when they would list the genealogies, they would not try to list every single individual, but sometimes they would skip certain individuals and only mention the notable names. Okay, so you need to keep that part in mind too, especially when we get to the end of the book. But so as we talk about the date of the occurrence of the events for the book of Ruth is in the early periods of Judges, early period of the Judges, in like 1300 up until about 1200, something up in that time period. However, the writing itself of the book was most likely during the 1000, up in 1000 BC, during the early reign of King David. Those are the estimate times. Okay, now with that, we can also talk about the occasion of the book. And what we'll find out is the book itself reads in a very narrative way. And that's one thing that makes the book so enjoyable. It reads like a very comfortable bedtime story where it takes us back to the period of the judges. And this, as I said earlier, was the early period of the judges because we do understand that the period of the judges covers roughly about 400 years. Okay, that's the book of Judges. From the time that the death of Joshua and the elders along with him, after bringing the people into the promised land, and those preceding generations of all of those particular tribal rulers. That's what we mean by the period of the judges. The different rulers of men that God would choose, they would be called the judges or the deliverers that God would choose when Israel had no king. This period of time up until the time of King Saul and King David. All right. So this period was about 400 years. And so it was in the early part of this period, for in the early part of Judges, let me say this too, because we also want to remember that Judges had I don't know. Let me say it this way. it descended into chaos. Can I say it that way? We see, and I don't want to get so much into the book of Judges, but it talked about the period of time when there was no king and people did what was right in their own eyes. That is basically the theme of the book of Judges. And the doing right in their own eyes showed how Israel descended. They spiraled downward into sin. They got worse and worse and worse. So, in saying all of that, the issues of Ruth, the story takes place during the early period of the Judges before Israel's descent into just straight out craziness. Maybe one day we'll also study the book of Judges so you guys can see the descent of Israel into sinful chaos. But going back here, this is the early times, okay? And the book sets it forward. We're not going to talk about it. How there was a particular man, Elimelech, and the point of it all was there was a famine in the land. He did not trust in God. He went down into Moab where he died, but he had two sons. They married. The two sons died, and thus leaving central figures in the story, Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who later returned to the land. In returning back to the land, they encounter, and this has to do with the providence of God, a particular kinsman of theirs by the name of Boaz, who at the end of the story marries Ruth, and the story has a happy ending with Naomi rejoicing because she now has other relatives to replace the relatives that died, her husband and her sons. And the story figures on the central love and loyalty of Ruth. And Ruth herself is a Moabitess who is a Gentile. All right. And so this is basically the occasion of the letter as it tries to weave in that theme of love and loyalty that Ruth has for her mother. And in that backdrop of that particular theme of love and loyalty, we have the family or the lineage of David is set forth for us. So that's basically the idea, the purpose, showing the love and loyalty that Ruth has for her mother-in-law as God allows this. God uses this as a backdrop to give us David's lineage, where David came from. Boaz, Obed, Jesse, King David, as it was said in the book. Okay, so the purpose of the book, three things: establish the lineage of David. Two, highlight the love and loyalty of Ruth. And then in the background of all of that, illustrate God's care and provision for his people, especially to those who are faithful to him. All right. Thanks, guys, for joining me with that. Cannot wait to get into our actual study of the book of Ruth, and I hope to see you in the study. All right. See you then.